Okay. Okay. So my name is Rachel Byer. I'm in Westminster, Colorado, and I'm meeting today with Bob. You're also in Westminster, Bob?
I'm sorry?
Are you also in Westminster?
Yes.
Yeah.
I live just down the street from Front Range Community College.
Oh, I'm not very far away. I'm close to 92nd and Sheridan. So pretty close. I like to drive past the campus.
Yes.
And today is August 28th, 2002. 2020. Oh my gosh. 2020 or 2020. I don't know what year it is. It's 2020. And we're meeting today with Bob Briggs, who's going to talk to us about the carnation industry and his public service and his interest in transportation and connections with those things. So why don't we go ahead and get started with you starting off by telling me where you want to start. What should we start talking about first?
Well, I graduated from Westminster High School in 1955. Right? During my sophomore year, in the summer of 1953, there was a greenhouse. We lived at that point at 68th and Low, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a greenhouse. It was across the street, but it was about 4 blocks away. There wasn't any other houses in there at that point. And they got hailed out. It was an all glass greenhouse. And they hired me to put the glass back in. So I spent the summer putting the glass back into the greenhouse and then stayed on to learn how to grow flowers and to do the other things that need to be done. You don't relate to this, but I do. I didn't want to wear a tie for a living. And the teachers I knew, the engineers I knew, the doctors I knew, the attorneys I knew, all wore ties. And I didn't want to do that. And the only guy I knew that didn't wear a tie was the guy that owned the greenhouse, Frank Galasso. And so Frank introduced me to Bob Holly, who was the professor of horticulture and floriculture at then Colorado A&M. And I was able to, with Bob's guidance, live in the greenhouse, the research greenhouse on the campus. And I got a free room, and our job was to be the night watchman, if you will, for the greenhouse. And there was 2 of us. And so my roommate was from Aspen. And so that's how I could afford to go to college, because didn't have any money, but was able to work basically full time on the campus in the greenhouses. And between working full time and having a free room, I was able to get a degree in horticulture. In fact, I got 2 degrees. I ended up getting a master's degree. I graduated with my bachelor's in 1959, and then my master's in 1961. And my research was the use of fiberglass as a covering for the greenhouses. And it turned out that was the first time that had been researched in any greenhouse. And that became the standard for the greenhouse industry. And so we created, with that research, a evolution or a revolution depend upon your point of reference, for the greenhouse industry and for the carnation industry. My wife's parents owned a farm at 68th and Pecos, unincorporated Adams. It's near Westminster, but it wasn't in the city limits. And they offered to build us a greenhouse when I graduated in 1961. And so that's how we ended up being in the greenhouse business. I graduated, started building. That fall, Labor Day, it snowed. Earliest snow in the history of Colorado in Denver, September 3rd, 1961. And I somehow remember that. But we didn't have we had the greenhouse enclosed, but didn't have the heat in. But a greenhouse gives you 10 to 15 degrees if you have a covering, even with no heat, gives you that much warmth. And so even though it froze, we still had some degrees of difference so the carnations didn't freeze. And so we put the heat in over Labor Day weekend in 1961. Fun stuff. And so when we started, there was 3 major wholesale houses in Denver. The Colorado Carnation was labeled in 1950. Right? It was the first trademarked perishable item in the United States, before Chiquita banana and Dole pineapples and those. It was the first, and it was the Colorado Carnation. And the industry evolved so that everything was sold through those, all the production. And there was close to 200 greenhouses. All the production was sold through those 3 wholesale houses. Denver Wholesale Florist, and they're still on basically 40th and Dahlia in Commerce City. And at that point, they were downtown off of 11th and Cherokee. The other wholesale house was Davis Brothers. Denver Wholesale had 125 growers. Davis's had 50. And then Park Elitch was the third one. And they had 25 growers. And so I went to Davis Brothers because I had worked for them. My well, I can't remember. I guess it was when I was in college. That summer, between for summer vacation, I worked for Davis Brothers. And so that's how I ended up taking all my flowers to the Davis Brothers. And for the 60s, I was the #1 grower for 5 years in a row at Davis Brothers. And they rated you for production. They rated you for monies earned per square foot. And I was top in both of those. When we built in 1961, we built the first fiberglass greenhouse built in the world, right? And it was a Lord and Burnham greenhouse. There was two major companies that produce greenhouses, and Lord and Burnham was one of them. And they had to figure out how to convert that glass greenhouse to a fiberglass greenhouse. And so we did a lot of pioneering because it was, well, because nobody else had done it. You know, you just had to figure it out. And so we figured it out. And it was fun. I can remember the wind blowing. When you have glass, piece of glass is 20 inches by 20 inches, right? A piece of fiberglass is 4 foot wide and 24 foot long. Okay, it has a lot of air space underneath of it. And I can remember the wind blowing, and we were putting on the last of the fiberglass, and I went out and laid on the fiberglass to keep it from blowing off. So, you know, minor little things like that that recall. In those days, they didn't have any battery operated drills. Everything was electric. And so we had to run extension cords. The greenhouse was 150 foot long. So we had to have 160, 170 feet of cords that we had to keep track of in order to have the electricity to drill the screw into the, they used redwood on to hold the fiberglass down, and we drilled into that redwood. Okay, so that was our job of making it work. It held up reasonably well. So,
That's really amazing.
I didn't hear you.
My apologies. That's really amazing. So you said your greenhouse, what was the square footage? It was 150 feet long by?
There was 3 houses, and it was 16,880 square feet. We called that eventually the South Range, and then we built the North Range, which was a little over 18,000. And then we built a retail range after the carnation market went to South America, and that was 12,000. So the 3 of them was a little bit more than an acre of greenhouse. An acre is 45,367 square feet. And so we had over an acre of greenhouse. We built the first range in 1961, the second range in 1968, and then the third one in 1973. Now, I was elected president of the Colorado Flower Growers Association, youngest guy to be elected president in 1970. And that was the same year that the first carnations came in from Colombia into the United States. We had a president from Texas. His initials was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Lyndon gave to the Colombian growers the technology of a greenhouse and the money to build it. And the most important thing out of all that was because he wanted them to have a crop so that they wouldn't grow cocaine anymore. This was the drug fight. Well, you know that if you follow that at all, there's still cocaine being grown in Colombia. And what it did was he gave them what is called favored nation status. And that meant that they could sell all of their products in the United States for the price of the box. And for the next 20 years, that's what they did. And within 20 years, the 220 carnation growers in Colorado, and we were second to California, all of the carnation production in California and Colorado and a few elsewhere went out of business because we couldn't compete with, in essence, those free flowers. So that's how the industry changed. I was in the 60s, inflation went up about 12%. So if we wanted to stay the same, we had to either have a 12% increase in production, or we had to reduce expenses by that. And so by the time we got to 1970, I had figured that out and was able to make that happen. And so when the market went to South America, the wholesalers and the retailers and everybody had to figure out how they were going to sell for the future. And I decided that the cut flower business was on its way out. And the only way we were able to survive is if we got into the retail business. And so that last 12,000 square feet was, first of all, that greenhouse was a Nexus greenhouse. It was the first Nexus, they're a local Denver company. It was the first Nexus greenhouse they ever sold. And it was 12,000 square feet. And we engineered it to be our retail range. And so that's how I got in the retail business. Now, 1973, our acre of greenhouse cost $5,000 to heat that acre of greenhouse. 1977, that same acre of greenhouse cost $27,000, 5-time increase. And the rest of the growers didn't have the advantage I had because I had gotten into the retail business and had expanded our sales so that the 27,000 was the same percentage as the 5. So we had increased our sales by 5 times. And by 1980, we were at a $500,000 in sales. And so we had increased better than 5 times the sales coming through our place. And we were growing everything that we were producing. And so we made money. And that was the object of the game, is to be able to grow it and sell it and make money. And so, are you familiar with what they call a Jiffy 7?
I am. I actually, after I got my horticulture associates, I ended up working for the USDA at one of the plant introduction stations, one of the gene banks. And so we used the Jiffy 7s quite a bit to get things started.
Well, one of the things that we found from a retail standpoint is if you rooted a cutting in Jiffy 7, because the thing that was selling a lot in those days was terrarium plants. So I could take a small rooted cutting, make it in a Jiffy 7, and I could root those in a week, 10 days, right? So that the roots were completely out of the Jiffy 7 now to the edge. And I would do them a tray, which is 20 inches long, basically 11 inches wide. And I could do a tray of those and put them out. And I sold terrarium plants 5 for $1. And I sold a lot of terrarium plants. I was the cheapest plant production system in Denver. And we were making $50 a square foot because it'd only take us a week to get that flower or that plant rooted. And by the time we got it rooted and another week to get it out the front door, in 2 weeks we had a complete turnover. And so we measured our returns by money per square foot. And if you can make $50 a square, that's pretty good money. And so 1980, a guy come by and he says, "You're making a lot of money." And I said, "Yeah, we are." The thing that happened to me in the interim was in 1978, I run for and was elected Adams County Commissioner, right? And now I had 2 full-time jobs. And it was very tough to do both of those. So one of the other things that I had this conversation with my wife's parents, who are our partners, we figured by 1978, we were averaging $10 a customer. And I didn't understand what I had to do then, but I knew that if I had $500,000 in sales, I had 50,000 customers, and our greenhouse was only equipped to handle efficiently 30,000, that we needed to build more greenhouses. And my father-in-law didn't want to do that. He said, "You got to make it work with what you got." And we had 10 acres there. And what our thought was, is we would build around the edge and use the center of that 10 acres for parking. But I couldn't convince him of it. And so then I decided to run for county commissioner and got elected. And so when the guy came to say, "We'll buy it," we sold. And he later went bankrupt because he couldn't figure out how to make it work. And we got it back, but that was after I lost my re-election bid in 1982. So do you want me to move into being a county commissioner?
Yeah, before we leave Carnations completely, what was the name of your retail center?
Briggs Carnation Farm.
Cool.
We,
So
original
certainly-
name.
I like it.
Yes.
Yes, please feel free to move ahead into talking about county commissioner. I'd love to know why you decided to run the first time and then moving into politics and your being since then.
Well, during the 60s, in 1964, I joined the Westminster JCs. It's the Junior Chamber of Commerce. 1965, I was the president. And during this time, I got to meet all of the county commissioners, the city council people, all of the elected officials, and decided that I could do that if it presented itself. So I run in 72 and lost, and then I run again in 78. And this time it was the off year of the Carter administration. And the national trend, I'm a Republican, the national trend was a Democrat year, or wasn't a Democrat year, it was a Republican year. And lo and behold, I won. I didn't expect to, but I did. And so 4 years later, it was the off year of the Reagan administration, and the Democrats were back in good graces, and they won. And so I got beat in 4 years. But there hadn't been a Republican reelected in Adams County since the 30s. So I didn't expect to win. But when I got to be a county commissioner, Denver was trying to expand Stapleton Airport onto the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. And that would have put 100% of the noise from the airport over Adams County. And I didn't think that was a good idea. And so I fought that. And people said, well, you don't have a chance of winning because Denver is the #1 political force in the state. And that may have been right, but it turned out that it wasn't. I ended up at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is a bunch of layers. And we ended up meeting with the guy who was 8th layer down, and he lied to me. And so when I came back to Brighton, I went on a letter writing campaign. And I wrote to everybody I could think of, saying, we don't trust you anymore, and all of those types of things. And at the end of that, the next time we went back, we went up to #2. We were just below the Secretary of Defense. And they said, no, they wasn't going to let the arsenal be used for an airport. And if Denver wanted a new airport, they were going to have to build one. Best thing that ever happened to Denver and the state of Colorado, because Denver International Airport, then as it's called today, DIA, as it was called in those days, has been so successful. Well, they're expanding right now. When they get the expansion done on the airport, they will have the ability to do 6 operations at the same time, 3 landings and 3 takeoffs at the same time. right? They'll be the #1 airport in the United States. And they still have 30% to go. When they do that last 30, they'll have the opportunity to do 4 landings and 4 takeoffs, or 8 at the same time. And they'll be the #1 airport in the world. So that's the importance of that airport. That airport today has caused Denver and the 7 states that touch Colorado to be the center of the next mega region in the United States. And if you think about mega regions, you have to think about New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta, and then there's Denver. Denver now is that next one. And so we were able to cause, because we caused DIA to be built, we closed down the expansion onto the arsenal. And out of that then came the good news that we have today. The other airport that was out there is called Front Range Airport, right? Well, at the same time we were arguing against DIA, we were in the process of putting together Adams County's airport, and that was Front Range. We had an agreement with the Federal Aviation Administration, and when he called me, when I was chairman in 1980 of the Board of County Commissioners, he said, "We're ready to build an airport." And I said, "Well, we hadn't talked about it, so let me call you back." And so 2 weeks later, I called him back and I said, "We got your airport ready. We've only got one minor technical glitch. We got an oil well in the middle of the runway. And all your planes have to do is when they come in, is go up over the oil well and then come down on the other side. And I'm sure they can do that." And he was stunned silent. And then I broke out laughing. I said, "No, we don't have an airport. But if you tell me that you'll call me in 6 months, I will have an airport for you." And that airport became Front Range Airport near Watkins. And that airport today is Spaceport. And Spaceport allows Denver International Airport, or DIN, to be 5 miles away from Spaceport. So you got people that we can run rail between them, and people can go to the Spaceport and be able to go to Australia in 4 hours. That's what Spaceport will do for us. And now both of those airports are side by side and working together. Because Front Range Airport was in existence prior to the time that DIN was built. The airspace above an airport is an inverted cup, or funnel. And so we were able to, because 5 mile separation, we were able to get both of them to operate side by side. And if we hadn't had it ahead of time, we wouldn't have. And if we hadn't have been able to do that, we wouldn't have had them so that they can work together for Spaceport today. Spaceport works because the new operations, instead of an airport takes off horizontal. Okay, on spaceport, they're going to shoot everything straight up and then let it go. And when that happens, you don't have that conflict of airspace. And that's why it works. So we were able to put together the airport. I got to tell you a quick story about our ribbon cutting. You know, good farmers that we are, they went out and they we bought 1,500 acres. And we disked it up, and the wind came. And the day that we had the ribbon cutting, it was so dusty that the cheese and the wine and all the food was all gritty. And so, you know, but we were able to live through it and make it work. During my tenure as a county commissioner, we laid off 10% of the people that work for us in Adams County, and then we're able to restructure that. When I was elected, there was a 30% turnover. I was able to calm it down, so we got back to a 4% turnover. And the more turnover you got, the more expense you get in terms of training. And we have the eastern part. Adams County runs 72 miles from Sheridan past Last Chance, from Colfax to 168th Avenue. And those roads in the eastern end of the county hadn't been regraded and gravelled in 40 years. And so we were able to do that. Bennett was the home of, we had 100 pieces of equipment out there. And the equipment was in a Quonset hut, and it could hold 3 pieces of equipment. So you get 3 of them in there. The one that controls the first 2, whether or not they move, is the last one in. You got to have it done and it out before you can get the other 2 out. And so it was a very inefficient way of taking care of business. So we built in Strasburg then a 20-unit garage that allowed us to put in all of our equipment. And then we built a sheriff's substation out there. And we were able to reinvent the service that went out there. The other thing is that was far enough away from Brighton that there was a long distance phone call. So we figured out how to have them call into the substation, and then we would relay that back to the county building, and so they could do it without a long distance phone call. The social services department, they were in the sheriff's substation in a chicken house. The chicken house was very good. It was either hot or cold. And so it was very inefficient. We built a 6-story building there for them so that they could operate more efficiently and moved everything into one building. The sheriff's substation, in a rain that spring, had a massive leak, and the county commissioners said they couldn't afford to fix it. And I said, you can't afford not to fix it because that roof's going to come down. And we fixed the roof. And one of the things that I brought to them because of my business experience is I understood that you had to reinvest in your infrastructure. If you didn't reinvest in your infrastructure, you're behind. And so I had several projects like that I was able to make happen. One of them was at 88th and Lowell. All right. Westminster had gone in and put in new water and sewer lines. They didn't backfill right, and it settled, right? And it settled about 12 foot. So there was a 12 by 12 hole there. And there was a lawsuit between Adams County and Westminster saying, it's your fault. And I said, what happens when the next settlement takes place and breaks a pipe? Water, sewer, didn't make any difference. I said, who has to pay for that? Well, they say we will, as Adams County. And I said, then let's fix it. You know, there isn't any sense of opening yourself up to a much bigger problem if you can solve it by going through. So we filled that hole. Nobody ever remembers that hole, but I do. Let's see, what else? 88th Avenue from Zuni to Tejon was a dirt road. And there's a lot of cars using it in those days. And so there was a lot of dust that settled in on the homes around there. And so I went out as a county commissioner and got it paved. Because, you know, a dirt road's a dirt road. One of my longtime friends was a guy by the name of Frank Kalsevik. And Frank, his first farm was right across from my wife's parents at 68th, and they sold to Pearlmac, and then Pearlmac went over and bought out Frank. And then Frank went up to 104th and Washington and bought more land. And Pearlmac came up there and started Northglenn on that land, right? So Frank went out and took that money, and he owns more of Adams County than anybody else today. He's got one of the large wheat farming operations. Well, he caught me in front of the county building and was yelling at me, "You caused me to get oil all over my carpet." And so I said, "How'd I do that?" He said, "Well, you dust abated, and in those days we took used oil from all the vehicles and put it on the road the dust abated. And when you did that, I drove over that road and it got on my car. I drove it into the garage and it dripped on my carpet. So that's my Frank Kalsovic story. Being a county commissioner is a fun job. It's the only elected position you have that you're all three branches of government. The three branches are administrative, legislative, and judicial. Judicial is when you issue a license, whether it be a liquor license or any other type of license. That's a judicial hearing, and you have to conduct that hearing like it was a courtroom, right? The legislative is the people who pass laws, and their ultimate responsibility is the budget, okay? The administrative is the people who spends the money. And county commissioner gets to be all three of those. So it's more like running a business than any of the other elected positions. I was on the RTD Board, State House, and City Council of Westminster, and the only one that I got to spend the budget, or spend the budget, yeah, was county commissioner. The rest of them, you had to hire somebody to do that. So at the end of my 4 years, I run for re-election, and I got beat. I ended up then trying several different businesses, but I applied back to the trade association of which I was president and of which I hired the executive, and he retired and they hired me to be the executive vice president of the Colorado Greenhouse Growers Association. And it was through that position that I got involved with Front Range Community College, CSU, all of the horticulture interest in the state. And did you ever hear of Plant Talk?
No, please, no, I haven't.
Plant Talk was a joint project between, we call them Green Industries of Colorado, Greenco, Denver Botanic Gardens, and CSU. And what it is to answer the 3,000 or 4,000 basic questions that a gardener has. And so you can go online today and ask any of those questions and get one answer. What was happening before is you got three interpretations of the same answer. And so Plant Talk was engineered to do one answer. And so I helped coordinate that and put it together. What's the plant introduction one? The advantage of being away from that for 30 years. Well, we introduce plants just for Colorado.
Oh, Shoot, it's on the tip of my tongue too.
Yeah. Well,
I know what you're
when it
talking
comes,
about.
when it comes, it comes. Anyway, we started that at about the same time. Because one of the things we formed when my first meeting of the board is I convinced my board of the Colorado Greenhouse Growers Association to go to the mountains and do a weekend board retreat. And they wanted me to do association activities, putting out newsletters, started a trade show, those types of things. And they wanted me to also lobby. And I said, I can't do both. There's just not enough time. But what we need to do is form the green industries. We didn't call it that at that point, but we said horticulture industries, so that the industries could pay for lobbyists. And because we were the starter of that, I was able to be the person who the lobbyists reported to. So I still had control, but I wasn't the lobbyist. And that worked out very well. And so we did that. And we also started then the wholesale florist of Colorado, the garden centers of Colorado, the Colorado Floriculture Foundation, the retail florist of Colorado. All of those started out of the greenhouse industry process. The industry, by the time I was hired in 1977, was on its way. The number of carnation growers was on its way out. We had a lot of bedding plant operations coming up. And so we reinvented the greenhouse industry to look more like the industry as we know it today. We got bedding plants and nursery crops and no cut flowers. So we did that. 1998. So the guy who had beat me, I had beat him as county commissioner candidate. And then he beat me in re-election. He was now on the RTD board. And so they wanted somebody to run against him. He was one of the negative people on the RTD board. The RTD board is 15 board members, 8 of them up for election, and 7 of them that run were incumbents. And the only way you win an RTD board race is if you get the top line. And the top line on the ballot is determined by the Secretary of State flipping a coin. And all 7 of us won the flip of the coin, and we were all elected. Our first meeting of the RTD board in January, the 4th Tuesday of January, we put together 3 projects. One is called FasTracks, or excuse me, T-Rex. That's the 20 miles south of Broadway and where the light rail comes in at Broadway. You know, I can't remember. Oh, it was I-25 and Broadway. Okay. The second one was we put together the planning process to do FasTracks. And the third one was we decided that if we were going to have FasTracks, we had to have Union Station. Okay. And so we took rail in the Union Station and ultimately bought Union Station. Those three things changed the way the state of Colorado operates. And because we now had rail connecting the airport, only the fifth airport in the United States to have rail to it. And that allows us to go. When we bought Union Station, we paid $55 million for it. We had 600 people a day using it. Today, once the COVID goes away, it'll get back to 60,000 people a day going through. It's on its way to 200, 300,000 people going through Union Station. When we bought Union Station, as I mentioned, we paid $55 million for it. It's 23 acres. We've sold off all of that acreage, but about 12 acres right in the center, right? That acreage that we've sold has brought into the coffers of RTD $4 billion with a B dollars. That's called transit-oriented development. When you're down there and look at all of that development that has taken place at Union Station, it was because we bought Union Station and reconverted it. And so that was a big, big part of making RTD's light rail system work, because we had a central hub. And when you talk about what the future lies, it's connecting the rest of the state. RTD serves half of the state's population, about 3 million people today. And we're on our way as a state to 18 million by 2100. In other words, everything that we have today has to be built again by 3 times by the time we get to the turn of the century. And that's why the transportation infrastructure that we have for state of Colorado is in dire needs of a major overhaul. We haven't had passenger rail in our state since 1965. And at the same time, passenger rail went away. What happened in 1965 that caused that? Minor thing. Eisenhower put together the interstate system, and jet airplanes came. Our friends at Stapleton everything that had been flying had been propeller driven. And that isn't that noisy. But when you make it all jets, which happened in 65, then it becomes very noisy. The people who lived under the flight paths and at DIA, you couldn't hear when those planes come over, and they were coming over every minute and a half, you couldn't hear yourself talk on the telephone or hear TV or any of those types of things because it was that noisy. And so the noise level that's called is 65 LDN, which is a average noise level. It's a 24-hour average. The new airport, then owns, it takes 5 miles from the end of the runways. Den owns 5 miles from all 16 runways, even though 12 of them have been built. All those runways right now, so that when they get all 16 built, they will own that LDN noise level at the end of all of those runways. So you can operate without upsetting your neighbors. All right, now, I got elected then. I decided to run for the State House and was elected then in 2002. And the two things that I carried that was critical was RTD Police Department didn't have any jurisdiction outside of Denver. And they run in counties outside of Denver. And so I carried a bill for them to give them police powers outside of Denver. And that allowed them to make arrests and patrol their system outside of Denver. One of the other things I did was I carried a bill that had been introduced 6 times, and finally I got it through, to reduce the driving under the influence from 1% to 0.08. And what that did was it gave Colorado $50 million at that point because we did that. So I carried 30 bills in my 2 years and was very, I think, very successful in doing that. But that in 2004, the Democrats decided that they had had a guy by the name of Polis and Stryker from Fort Collins and 2 others, all multi-billionaires, put all their monies in one pot and orchestrated against 8 Republican office holders. And the 8 of us that they targeted were all 8 that lived in seats that were competitive. And you can't win those seats if you're a very conservative Republican. You have to be moderate in order to attract enough voters to win those seats. That's one of the seats I had. And they put $1 million into my seat to beat me, and they did. And so then that was 2004. 3 years later, somebody said, you ought to run for city council. And I did. And my greatest accomplishment of city councils was 2. One was that I didn't know city councils have a way of paying for infrastructure projects. And it's called revenue bonds. They have the ability to establish an authority. It takes two local governments to do that. Good example of this is Thornton and Westminster established an authority to build 140, the interchange at 144th, 136th, and rebuild the bridge at 128th. And they issued revenue bonds paid for by the increased value of property taxes on each of those interchanges. And I didn't know that they could do that. And the reason that's important is when I get done talking about water, I want to come back and talk about railroads again, because I want to reestablish railroads in the state of Colorado, and I want to pay for them using revenue bonds, right? The other thing is Westminster had at that point in the 60s, mid 60s, they worked with Farmers Reservoir and Irrigation Supply Company, FRICO, and they bought into Stanley Lake and rebuilt that. The interesting story there was this was the third time that they had been to Stanley Lake, and the first two times the farmers own that reservoir, and the farmers and government, because I was a farmer from my greenhouse days, understand this. Farmers have an inherent mistrust of government. And so they voted down twice going in business with Westminster to rebuild Stanley Lake. The third time, one other thing happened, and that's that the state water engineer came to Farmers Irrigation and Reservoir Company and said, if you don't rebuild that dam, you're going to have to breach it, and you won't have 15,000 acre feet of storage behind it. And they said, well, who's going to pay for that? And he said, that's your problem. You own it. And Westminster came along and said, we'll pay for it. And they said, oh, good idea. And that's how they ended up in business. So that Westminster owns 52% now of Stanley Lake. And North Glen owns some, and Thornton owns some. The farmers only own 20% of that. But they got inherent rights to the storage there. And they don't have to pay for it. After Westminster bought it, about 10 years later, it fell apart. And Westminster went out and rebuilt it. They just fixed it. And the farmers would never have been able to do that because they didn't have the ability to borrow money. Westminster, because they had the water source that they could sell, and it's those dollars that could pay for the maintenance of Stanley Lake. And that's what keeps it going. Westminster manages Stanley Lake. Well, anyway, in the mid 2012, 2013, Westminster was talking about the future. And I said, you got water to build everything on one level, but the future, because we're going to be at 18 million people, goes this way. And they said, we got enough water to do this. We don't need more. I said, the future is this way. After 2 years, I convinced them, maybe, that the future was this way. And that's when we went and bought 30% of the water in Stanley Lake. We said to the farmers, we don't need it today. You can use it for 20 years, but in 20 years it's ours. And we bought their water rights. And that allowed us to then get more water rights within that to allow us to go this way. Now, the problem that Westminster has is in 1970, they went on a major campaign to annex. Westminster at that point wasn't north of 92nd, wasn't in Jefferson County. So they annexed from 92nd to 158th, from I-25 to Indiana. Right? Now Jefferson County and Adams County are equal in space. But 55% of the citizens of Adams live in Adams and 45% live in Jefferson. So I got to give you one other quick story. Stanley Lake is our primary source of water. If somebody had dumped something into Stanley on purpose or by accident, and it destroyed that lake, we didn't have a way of getting water from our water source, Clear Creek, into our water treatment plant. And so in 2014, we built a 6-foot water line from Clear Creek to our water treatment plant so we could get water direct from Clear Creek if we needed it. And that made water a lot more available for Westminster. Now, there's a lot more we can talk about, but that gives you the overview. Now, in 2015, I'm term limited. And so I've been working on it since I was on the RTD board, bringing passenger rail and local freight back to the front line, front range. And what we want to do is form an intergovernmental agreement authority, and that authority issue revenue bonds to build the infrastructure of whatever we're working on. There's $30 billion with a B dollars of infrastructure that needs to be put in so that by the time we get to 2100 and we got the rest of the state all connected back into Denver, we can get, you can go from, I don't know where your favorite university is, but my guess is it has to be Fort Collins. You can get to a trip to Fort Collins, you can get to a trip to Laramie, you can get to a trip to Cheyenne, You can get a trip to Yellowstone. You can get a trip to Salt Lake City. You can get a trip to Phoenix and Tucson. You can get a trip into Lubbock and Texas. You can get a trip into Tulsa. You can get a trip into Kansas City, Omaha. All of those will be available to you. So that if you wanted to take an airplane, and 60% of all the flights out of DIA today are 300 miles or less, we can have a rail service that in the same amount of time it takes you to go to the airport and fly, because you have to go 2 hours ahead of time and all of that. We can get you to those towns with a rail car that can go 200 or 300 miles an hour. And so that's what we're trying to put in place. So,
Well,
question.
I have to say, I am 100% for that. I love taking trains. I lived in Japan, and so I understand the important, like, I understand, like, how amazing train infrastructure is. And then I also just moved back out here in the fall from Philadelphia, and I only ever took the train out there because you can get, you know, so I love this concept that you're developing of tapping into the revenue bonds to put in this kind of train system. And I think that speaks to also things like climate change is going to start affecting flight travel and things like that. I mean, how does that play? I mean, like you said earlier, you're a Republican. How does that play into tapping into, say, Democrats who would be interested in rail for climate reasons as opposed to other types of reasons?
Well, in order to use revenue bonds, I have to get my operating cost below $5 a mile. Right? In order to do that, I have to use renewable energy. Right? And I have a battery source that I can use or hydrogen. Both of them, hydrogen is water. Right? Both of them can make us zero emissions. And so all the train infrastructure that we put in, I got to build these cars because nobody's doing that. But we've got to figure out that it can operate consistently around $3 or less a mile. And that allows us then to charge whatever local fares we have to charge, allow that fare box to pay for that infrastructure. And we think we can do it. And we can do it with electric vehicles, and you don't have to run. Right now, every RTD vehicle has the overhead catenary. It costs RTD $25 a mile to operate that vehicle. And we want to do it with not doing that for less than $5. The advantage of not doing that, to put that catenary in, I can build my tracks 3 times further tracks just for the price of the catenary. So if I don't have to put a catenary in, then I can build 3 times more tracks for the same dollars. We're planning on using for the track bed, a pre-stressed concrete bed. And when you get on a light rail vehicle, if you get any movement like this, that means that the tracks are not level. And if you build them off of pre-stressed concrete, you're not going to get any of that. It'll be level. Because in order to do 300 miles an hour, I've got to have a level track. right? So that's the type of thing I've been thinking about.
You're making me excited to think that we're going to have bullet trains here in Colorado the way that I did in Japan. That's a
Well,
experience.
the other thing we're going to do is we're going to double stack the passenger car, right? The upper deck will have windows on both sides. So when you go down Glenwood Canyon, by the time we get there, we'll have all new growth. And you want to see that all new growth, you can see that out of both sides of the canyon. When you go through the Royal Gorge, you can see both sides of that canyon. Plus, as you go through the mountains, you can see on both sides, right? What that allows us to do, in 2019, Colorado had 85 million visitors. That number has diminished a lot, but will come back. And when it comes back, those visitors are the ones I want to rent that upper deck to. Because when I was in Europe, we went to Switzerland and Germany and Holland and England and France, all of that, all on trains. And so we paid through the nose for that pass, but it's the best thing I ever did, because I just walked up and said, here, I want on, and I got on and off I went. So that's what we're planning on doing.
Well, it's very exciting.
It is, it is. All I gotta do is convince RTD and CDOT that it's something that will work.
Yeah.
And some days I think I'm close, and other days I know I'm not.
Do you find it's harder to convince? I mean, you referenced traveling around in Europe, and like Europe, Japan, other non-American countries tend to be much more accepting of rail. Do you find that you come up against resistance to rail?
No, what I find is when I talk to people up and down the Front Range, they said, if you build this, you have to promise me that I can get into the mountains. Because if I can't get into the mountains, then I don't want, I don't want you to build it. If I can get you into the mountains, one of our projects goes into Summit County. And if we go into Summit County and service those 5 ski resorts with passenger rail, that'll reinvent the ski industry and reinvent the travel industry going into the mountains. And that's what we're planning on doing. We'll have a train that will service Central City and Black Hawk. And if we can do that, then all of a sudden we can get 3 or 4 times the number of people going to those 2 towns, and that's the same track that will take us into Summit County.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, like that will reduce a lot of vehicle traffic, and I mean, a much more leisurely way if you're going to go up gambling or if you're going to go up skiing, to not have to drive yourself up there, to be able to ride up on the train. Yeah.
And we can do it 24/7, 365, rain, snow, or accident.
It's great. It's fantastic. Well, is there anything else that you want to share with me today, or anything that you want to go back to, or?
Well, what I want you to do when you decipher all this and you say, I want more information about X, Y, or Z, then come back and let's talk about X, Y, or Z based upon what your needs. And I have had the good fortune of being on several ends of this transportation issue. And, you know, nobody's giving me credit on that yet. Eventually, somebody's going to figure it out. And that's why it's important that we do this type of thing, because nobody has the recap on DIA like I've just given you. Nobody's giving you the recap on RTD like I've just given you. Nobody's, you know, when you start talking about all these things, there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle. And
I have a friend who is very interested in listening to this interview once I get it all processed. He is finishing his dissertation on conversations between about transportation and climate, not necessarily climate change, but transportation and
Years ago, they did quite a
and so
little.
Yeah.
the way that local governments and consumer rights groups and things like that talk about smog and talk about all sorts of different transportation related.
Okay, well, I appreciate you
I
calling
think
me.
you will be interested in hearing this, but also maybe.
Sorry, I'm at a couple things.
okay,
So I can try and figure out how
I
to
personally
get
am
in your bed and.
I'm I do have a question I wanted to ask you about whether or not you were ever in the FFA or whether you were connected to the FFA at all.
no, I was not. Now, when I was a county commissioner, the the greenhouse industry was a good industry in Adams County. And so I caused Adams County to put together another extension agent just for greenhouses.
Oh, wow.
So, but I've been a very big supporters of FFA, of 4-H, because anything we can do for our kids, it's worthwhile.
Yeah, I actually am finishing my PhD dissertation myself. It's just this job came up in November and it just seemed like too much of an opportunity for me to not take. But my dissertation is on the future farmers of America and farm policy and in the 20th century. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about the relationships between government and business and farming and things like that. So always have to sneak in my FFA question at the end.
Yes.
Well, this
Well,
is
I was on, just to follow through on that, I was on both Adams County Extension Advisory Board and the state of Colorado's Extension Advisory Board, and both of them for over 10, 12 years. So
fantastic.
I spent a lot of time there too.
So talk about.
Yes.
I appreciate you calling me.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. I think if you feel good about this being a good spot to end, we'll end here, and then I will get back to you with details about. It normally takes me about a month to get the interview up online because I have the official process of getting it accessioned and everything. And but I will definitely be back in touch with you about further questions we might have, things like that. And we already have an amazing donation from you that came in. Was it last year?
Yeah.
Like things and things like that. So this
I got four more boxes.
Oh. Well, we'll have to. Well, if it's something that you want to add to your donation on that, I can hook you up with the right curator for that.
Well, I will, but the problem is you all haven't quite reopened yet.
That's true, but we are all still working, and so we're all still processing things. So yeah, so that's definitely a conversation we can have if you want to do that as well.
I do. As I continue the search for stuff or
Excellent.
through stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me today, Bob. It's been just a delight to spend time listening to your story and talking with you this morning. You're
more than welcome. I appreciate your doing this.
Yeah, very exciting. Have a lovely weekend.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.